Andrea Romano. Domo arigato, geek to me radio, da 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 da. Domo arigato, geek to me radio, da 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 da.
Welcome, geeks and nerds, girls and boys, to a brand new episode of Geek to Me Radio. Tonight, we are celebrating Batman the Animated Series' 30th anniversary with the woman who cast the iconic voices and directed the entire series of the show from the voice perspective, Andrea Romano. Behind the scenes talk about all the stuff she's done, who she enjoyed working with the most, her favorite memories, a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff. We talked to her exclusively about this series, and she and I talked for so long, it was almost an hour and a half we talked. I had to cut that down because we have to do this between the commercials and everything else we've got in this show. I had to do it in less than an hour, so I had to chop a lot of good stuff out of there. So luckily, Joey V is going to, after the show airs, he's going to put the full interview online at geektomeradio.com. So listen tonight. It's a great interview, and I don't want you to miss any of this, but then it's kind of like you're going to get the director's cut later this week. You can go to the website, geektomeradio.com, and check out the full interview with Andrea Romano, swear words and all. We put it all out there for you guys. Of course, she's not going to swear. She's a wonderful little lady. But with that said, we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of Batman, and we're going to kick it off starting right now. I'm joined once again by a woman whose talent knows no bounds. She's always gracious with her time, and it's always my extreme pleasure to have her on the show, the one and only Andrea Romano. How are you?
I'm so good. Thank you very much for having me. It's always nice to chat with you.
You as well. You're just always such a font of information, and people love hearing from you because you've got all the, you know where the bodies are buried, really, when it comes down to it.
It's true.
And this is 30 years of Batman. Debuted in September, obviously, of 1992. When you look back and think of it, it must, at some aspects, I would think it seems, oh yeah, that was 30 years ago. Other aspects of it, it must seem like it was just yesterday.
Oh, it's mind-blowing that 30 years have passed. It's absolutely amazing. Certainly, it doesn't feel like it was just yesterday, but it also certainly doesn't feel like it was 30 years ago. I'm always so amazed at not just the longevity of the series, but the fans still crave all the Batman stuff that we were able to produce. But the Batman the Animated Series specifically, people always seem to harken back to that as kind of the benchmark for animated series that were action series that were based on comic books or graphic novels or other material. But they seem to really look to that series as kind of having set a benchmark for how animated series involving, especially the DC universe, how they should be. It seems that seemed to set a standard that everybody has had to kind of live up to, which is lovely because it was a high standard then, and it's still a high standard now. But it is some of the work that I am most proud of. The people that came to play, it was a relatively easy sell as a casting director to call up an agency and say, I have this project. You didn't have to explain to them what Batman was. Right. Everybody knows who, whether they were fans or not, they knew who it was. You didn't have to say, it's about this really wealthy guy who lost his parents in a horrible incident, and now he's into vengeance, and, everybody knows who it is. And because of that, and because once we actually did get such a remarkable main cast together, many, many actors, either individually by themselves or through their representation, reached out to me to say, I really want to be a part of that series, specifically that Batman series, because that's special and that's different, and that's asking for a different kind of animation voice acting than we had seen at the time. Animation voice acting tended to be quite broad, really cartoony, if you will, and and especially with Batman, you think about before that, all that was really known about Batman was the Adam West live action series, which was very cartoony, very broad, very comic. And that was my first introduction. And I was very glad that the idea was to go for a much darker version, not so scary that we'd frighten children, although we probably did scare a few. But it was much more about, let's do, we talked about, Bruce Timm and I talked about the quality of the voices that we wanted, different than what we were doing. For example, Bruce and I were working previously on Tiny Toon Adventures together and a couple of other series that were quite broad and quite cartoony, if you will. And we talked about, we wanted it to be much more theatrical, much more filmic, if you will. And so that was quite a change in the way cartoons were being voiced back then. And it opened up a tremendous number of actors to me as a pool of talent than I had before. Because a lot of actors who can do really good voice work for a show like Batman the Animated Series wouldn't necessarily be good on an Animaniacs episode or a Pinky and the Brain episode. So it suddenly opened up lots and lots of stage actors, those kinds of actors who mostly do realistic type work but with a boosted energy. And so that works really well for animation. So I was so lucky to get in on it from the get-go and to be a part of it, and something that has had 30 years of fandom. Remarkable.
You mentioned so many things during that, what you just said there. And one of the things that stuck to me, just what you said about how people wanted to be attached. I think, if anything, Batman may have kind of changed how actors look at animated series and voiceovers, because it seems like prior to Batman the Animated Series, like you said, there were your normal people who were fantastic at it, the BJ Wards, the Neil Rosses, who worked on all these things, very, very talented people, Frank Welker. But it's almost like then all of a sudden now, when you fast forward 30 years, we've got top level, like A-list stars who do $20 million motion pictures now say, hey, I want to voice a cartoon dragon in My Little Pony or something.
Absolutely. And I think there's many reasons for that. I think part of it is a lot of those actors with children, relatively small children, the kids couldn't really watch the on-camera TV shows that they were making. Say they were on a regular on a CSI or, NCIS or any of those procedural shows like that. Their young kids really couldn't watch them because they were either too violent or too graphic. But Batman the Animated Series, their kids could watch. Not to mention how their children reacted to the fact that their dad was going to be, or their mom was going to be on a Batman episode. They became heroes in their own households just because, you're kidding, you're going to be on a Batman episode? It suddenly became this whole other thing. And many actors mentioned that to me, is that this is something finally that I'll be able to sit down with my kids and watch. And so that was always kind of a nice thing. The other thing was that actors like to act. And before this kind of show opened it up to actors who had more stage experience or film experience or TV experience, before that, the only people that I was familiar with who were of celebrity status, and that's always quite a questionable term, celebrity.
Sure.
You could be, someone who has done 150 episodes on some show, and I've never heard their name before because there's just so much programming that, celebrity means, I guess, a known actor. But my point was they come to they came to me to do voices, whereas before the only people I was aware of were people like Anne Margaret, who played Anne Margrock, and Tony Curtis, and both were on the Flintstones. They both did Flintstones episodes. But other than that, you try to think back on people who were genuinely celebrities, name talent that you would recognize them by their name only, and nobody was doing it. It kind of was lesser. They kind of looked down on voice work in general, whether it was commercial voice work or movie trailers or any of that stuff. It was like, no, that's, if you have nothing else in your life, maybe you'll agree to do a voiceover. And it changed after Batman and Superman and Justice League and a lot of the shows that I was very proud to be a part of, where people went, this is a remarkable art form where we can show our skill, our talent at acting, but we don't have to memorize lines. We don't have to have a makeup and wardrobe call. We don't ever have to come off script. We can sit there in front of a microphone and just read right off the page as long as we're acting. And so there were a lot of benefits for it. So it exploded. It really did. After Batman the Animated Series first came out, after the first season aired, there was a major change in the way people wanted to come and play in animation.
And I'm curious because originally, obviously, this was on Fox Kids, made its debut on Fox Kids, moved to Sunday nights because it was a more, I don't want to say more adult theme, but it was aimed at a slightly older audience than your normal X-Men the Animated Series on Fox Kids or Freakazoid or something like that. So
right.
When that change happened, was that something that move was done on Fox's part because they realized that they had something special, or just because this is too adult, we're going to move it till a little bit later in the evening?
Maybe they need, I don't have the answer to that question 100%. I don't know for sure, but I would speculate that a possibility certainly would be that they had a time slot, and what are we going to put in there that's going to get the best audience? And they went, oh, Batman the Animated Series. Put it on in the evening, and then you get the parents and the kids, and it's already got a following. So it kind of was a good guess, a good plan. Yeah, I forgot that and then weren't we with the not Cartoon Network, excuse me. What was it called? It was the network that was.
Oh, you moved to the WB, I think, right? Was that after?
Oh, the Kids WB. That's it. Kids WB. That's right. It's not funny. So many series, so many shows, many networks, so many platforms. I get them confused. But yes, so it had many incarnations. And there was a period of time when, especially when we were working with Fox, where that just added a whole other level of people that had a say in what we could air, what we could put in our script,
right,
what they wanted to see. And the more people you put into that mix, the more conflict you have as far as, I want to see this, I want to see that. So the fewer people that we had that were sort of trying to put their hands on our work made it easier for us. And we sure did make a darn good show. I look at some episodes now and I'm just astounded at how good they were and how wonderful the talent was, and how after I had by that point, by the time I was directing Batman the Animated Series, I kind of had developed a bit of a reputation as a voice director and as a casting director. And so agents kind of trusted me to give me their top tier talent, knowing that they weren't going to come out of the session going, man, that was unpleasant. A big part of my job was always to make sure that it was a pleasant experience for everybody, which is a main reason why I wanted to do the ensemble record. Yeah. That's really pleasant. Yeah. When you're all by yourself, isolated, and it's just me and the actor, I mean, we certainly can have a good time, directing and acting against each other, but so much better to act with the actors who are really going to be doing the role. And so that we could play a scene and I could run through the whole scene with everybody there and then do pickups if we needed to, and then maybe run through the scene one more time. And we know we had it. When you record it by individually, everybody's recorded by themselves, you have to do so many more takes of every line because you're not sure what the next actor is going to do and what's going to cut together. And so I liked the ensemble record. I liked the comfortable environment. That was a big part of my job, creating a comfortable environment for people to come and play. And also, I often refer to casting because even after you have the main cast, there's a tremendous amount of casting that has to be done for guest stars and incidentals. Right. A lot. And so I had to really be aware of who would work well together, who would have fun, who would. I often likened it to putting together the guest list for a party. Who's going to bring something to the party? Who's going to have fun with the other people who are there? Who's going to fit into this group? And that always seemed to make it a really positive experience. And I'm encouraged by that because people who were on the series, either as regulars or came in and guested, they often tell me that they couldn't wait to come in and see who I had cast as, they'd received the script a few days before we were recording. They're like, oh, who's going to come in and play Ra's al Ghul? Who's going to come in and play, whatever guest star we had at the time? And it became really fun for me to keep a list of people who had either reached out directly or through their agents or that I just thought of. And then when the castings would come through, I would look and say, oh, you know who would be good for this is David Warner. We haven't had him in a while, or so-and-so. And then that would be kind of a fun way to go through many of the actors that I had wanted to work with. And to be really honest with you, there was a very selfish part of that casting, which is I would think about actors who I loved, whose work I admired, who I wanted to have the chance to direct, to, see what they were like. And only a few of them did I not manage to get in to come and play with me at some point during my career throughout some show. One of them was the great Christopher Lee. I wanted so very much for him to come and play, and he had expressed an interest, and he was happy to do it if he could work it into his schedule. If he was, and think about this: when we were making Batman the Animated Series, there was no ISDN line, there was no satellite recording at the time. We had phone patch, but that was a really bad setup. It was so rudimentary, and because Mr. Lee was often in London, in England anyway, to set up the call there was a time problem, and then I'm basically listening to his session over a telephone line, an international telephone line in the early 90s, and then you just can't tell. You just can't tell. The phone lines would cut out. It would get staticky, whatever. So I needed to have him in the country at least and available when it didn't matter that he maybe couldn't make an ensemble record, but I did want him to be in the country so he could have the best connection anyway. And it just never worked. And when he passed, I was so sad because he was like one of those that got away. And the other one that is on such a different end of the spectrum that I always wanted to come in and also wanted to come and work with me. I did meet him, and we chatted about this at an Emmy event one night, and that's Alex Trebek.
Oh, yes.
I wanted so very much. And when I mentioned it to him at the Emmys, and you can get a lot of people to chat with you when you're holding an Emmy in your hand.
Sure.
And so he was very, very kind and very forthcoming. And I said, I'd love to have you come and play with me sometime. And he got very animated, if you will. He said, I can do many voices. And I said, I know, I've heard you do them on the show, on Jeopardy. And that was just a matter of timing. We couldn't get him in. There was one show I was working on where I thought he would have been a great guest, and I couldn't convince the producer. This was not a Batman show, but I couldn't convince the producer. The producer wanted to use a comedian doing a game show host. But those are only two people I could think of that I really desperately wanted to work with, and they got away.
You mentioned the great Christopher Lee, and obviously you mentioned the great David Warner, who sadly has just passed away earlier this year, which was
so sad.
As a fan, I was heartbroken. But obviously, you who worked with the man and knew him, it must be a whole new level of sadness for someone who's worked with him intimately on a set. And we're going to take a quick break. No intros and outros tonight. This is such a tight show because I had to, like I said, take an hour and a half conversation and shrink it down to fit within an hour of our broadcast time. But I do want to take this time to make sure we tell you about our official movie sponsor, Marcus Theaters. MarcusTheaters.com is the website. Head there, find the location of the Marcus Theaters or the movie tavern closest to you. I highly recommend also, if you have your smartphone, you download, like I have, the Marcus Theaters app. It's right there. And you can use that to find the location of the Marcus Theaters closest to you, get your tickets. Hopefully you got it on the free popcorn this weekend that they had going on. Use the app because there's always something going on. They'll always notify you of something happening. You can check out the movies that are now showing, the movies that are coming soon. It's like having the website right there in the palm of your hand. I know I'm talking like a grandpa because that's what the phone is. We have the internet in the palm of our hand. But their app is so helpful. You can order your concessions. If you're on your way and you're running late, order your concessions right there through the app so they're ready and waiting for you. When you show up at the movie theater, you grab them, go right into your movie, and enjoy the movie because that's what it's really all about, is enjoying these great movies that are out right now. Smile is coming out soon. We're right into the fall. We're into horror movie season. Smile looks like it's going to be amazing, so you can bet I will be seeing that at my local Marcus Theaters, probably either St. Charles or Ronnie's. Those are the two closest to me, I guess, positioning-wise. But it's always a good time to see a movie in the best possible surroundings with the best possible sound, and that is always the case at Marcus Theaters. MarcusTheaters.com, once again, is that website. Be sure to check them out, Marcus Theaters, for the best movie-going experience in the galaxy. We left off with Andrea Romano before we took that quick break for my live read, and we were asking her about working with the late, great David Warner, who voiced Ra's al Ghul, and I said it must have been even more heartbreaking for you than it was for us, the fans, because you knew him, you worked with him, and here's what she had to say about working with David Warner.
He was a wonderful, man, aside from being a remarkably talented actor. And I had met him a million years ago when I was a voiceover agent at an agency called Special Artists. And that agency was at the time owned by and run by a woman named Liz Dalling, a British woman. And so she had lots of British contacts. And very often she would have some wonderful British actor sitting in her office, and she'd call me in and say, "This is David Warner." And he would, "Oh, I know who David Warner is." And he would like to do voiceover. "Oh, my goodness, I would love to work with him." And I don't think he ever signed with the agency, but that's when I met him. So we're talking about the early 1980s is when I met him. And then he worked with me on several projects, including, and I admire him so much for this, you mentioned the series before, Freakazoid,
Yes.
which was such a silly, cartoony, wonderful show. And he played a villain called the Lobe, and we always referred to him as Loby. And it was such a silly character. And although he was playing an evil character, there were instances where we would do like a musical version of an episode, and it was to take off on "Hello Dolly," and it was "Hello Loby," and he said, I must tell you, Andrea, I can't sing," and I said, "All the better. That will only make it better because we want it to not be a slick,
Right.
clean, Broadway type musical. We want it to be kind of off. And so what a good sport. And then when Ra's al Ghul, which is the character I wanted Christopher Lee to play, when he couldn't, and I thought, oh, David Warner would be so lovely. And what a great job he did as Ra's al Ghul. I mean, perfect. And then to have Olivia Hussey come and play Talia al Ghul, which was just also wonderful. It was such a good show that allowed me so many opportunities to bring in remarkably good actors.
It's always interesting to see when you talk about the caliber of actor. I think since the last time I talked to you, and it was shortly before he passed away, I did have the pleasure of speaking with Ed Asner, and I'd asked him about the kind of Batman adjacent, because obviously he played Roland Daggett in Batman the Animated Series, but you offered him the role of Granny Goodness, and he told me, if anybody but Andrea Romano had offered me that role, I would have said they were crazy. He said, I trusted Andrea implicitly, and I was glad to do it. So
thank you for telling me that. Thank you. I loved him so much. All these wonderful actors that we have lost recently, it just breaks my heart. It also reminds me that we're all getting a little older as time is going on. But that delightful willingness to be silly. And, Ed Asner worked for me a lot on a lot of different series, everything from The Boondocks to, people like Marion Ross, who would come in and play characters that had to say, really dark things. But they did trust me. And I wanted them to trust me because I wanted them to know that ultimately I would not let them leave the studio, unless we were all happy with the performance. And, I wanted them to be comfortable with what they were being asked to do. And if something came up, and you mentioned Michael Ansara specifically, Mr. Freeze, when he first came in to do his first episode, we got all through the whole thing, and I thought he had done an excellent job. And we finished it, and Bruce Timm said, it's not what I had in mind. It's just not quite right. And I said, okay, stand by 1 second. And I hit the talk back, and I said, Michael, can you stay just a little bit longer after I release the cast? Oh, sure. And so everybody else left, and he stayed. I always referred to it as staying after school. And we redid all of his lines. Now, he already had full context. He knew what the actors had done on the line before his line and the line after, because he had been there in the session. So I didn't worry so much about recording him all by himself. And we just played with the voice until we found something that everybody was happy with. And we spent another maybe 40 minutes re-recording his lines. And then we all just fell in love with that character. I was not a very big Mr. Freeze fan before that. His performance is so nuanced and subtle, and I was unaware of his history. I had to always go to Bruce Timm or Paul Dini or Alan Burnett and find out, wow, what's the deal with this? And oftentimes it was a good thing when I had to ask, because they would think we have to include some of that in the episode so that the fans who don't know the characters get a better sense. But his loss of his wife and the coldness that we added to his voice was not just because of the freezing. It was because he was heartbroken.
Yeah.
He literally had his heart broken, and it made him unable to have normal emotional access, and Michael added that to the voice in such a simple way that it wasn't robotic, it wasn't icy and cheesy, it was cold and embittered, and I loved his performance.
And Heart of Ice, the episode you're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, that was the very
Yep.
first episode of Batman the Animated Series that was nominated for an Emmy, correct? Or
How
am I
cool is that?
misremembering?
I don't remember, but how
Okay.
cool is that?
I
love
think that's
that.
true. And Kevin Conroy has talked before. Obviously, Kevin makes no secret of his love for Mark Hamill, but he said Michael Ansara is probably one of the best people to be in the booth across from of any of the villains who came in. He highly speaks of Michael Ansara as well.
Oh, wonderful. You know, what was so weird, I'm very glad to hear that. And Kevin, I adore him so. But it's interesting because if you were to be in the studio with me to watch me record, I had to stay on the script, meaning my eyes had to stay on the script a lot because I had to make sure that they weren't dropping a line or dropping a word or that we were getting, or I would have to check the stage direction to make sure that if the character needed to be running during that line, I told the actor that so they would do the line like they were running. And so I didn't always get to look up and watch the actor's work. And I always felt like I missed a little something by not being able to just watch the actors, because those kind of things would happen. What I would do is I did like to have the setup, when possible, be in a horseshoe, meaning that the actors could look across the horseshoe at each other. Mm-hmm. And try not to put people talking to each other in scenes seated next to each other, because then they would have to turn their heads to look at the other actor, and that would get them off mic, and so their voice wouldn't sound right anymore. So I'd like to try to set them up across from each other so they could actually look up from their scripts and act into each other's eyes. And there's a wonderful drawing that my husband did. My husband is a character designer and a caricaturist, and he came to watch Mark Hamill do an episode with the Joker, and he drew this fantastic caricature of Mark, and it's also a bit of the Joker in the caricature in front of the microphone. He's working, and it does really explain how Mark looked different when he would act as the Joker. His physical, he would always stand because he just gave so much energy to that character. You really couldn't get enough breath sitting. But he would stand and he would kind of attack the microphone in a way different than if he were playing some other character. And so that's always kind of fun to watch. And I remember one episode, the actor was Chad Einbinder. Chad Einbinder is the father of Hannah Einbinder, who is now the second star on Hacks, the series Hacks.
Oh, yes.
And Chad worked for me quite a bit. And I remember him in an episode of Batman. I forget specifically the character, but I remember hearing Bruce Timm say to his, I don't know if it was the storyboard artist that was in the session with us or the director, the animation director, I remember Bruce saying to that person, watch Chad as he does this line, because that's exactly how I want you to animate the character when he's saying that line. So that kind of thing is so cool to watch the actor embody an animated character. Really wonderful to see that kind of thing.
And I'm curious, too, obviously, during the course of the series, ran for 85 episodes for the original Batman in the Animated Series before we got to Batman the New Adventures and everything else. You had some people obviously were replaced through whatever reason. Clive Revel was replaced by Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. as Alfred. You had Arlene Sorkin, obviously, as Harley Quinn, was replaced later on by Tara Strong, who also replaced Melissa Gilbert as Batgirl. When you have a new actor coming in for the role, as a voice director, do you kind of want them to stay kind of towards what had been done before? Do you let them kind of, because we're seeing the same physical animation of the character, the look for Batgirl did not change, the look for Harley Quinn did not change. How do you approach that with a new actor in the same role on something like this? That's
a very interesting question. A lot of it depends on why the actor was replaced. Clive Revel only had the first one or two episodes, or very few episodes of the Batman animated series, and then came to me and said, oh, by the way, I'm leaving next week on a world tour of some play he was doing, and he was going to be all over the country and the world. And as I said before, we didn't have the technology to follow people around to record them from wherever they were. So that was a purely logistic reason. We just couldn't get him when we needed him. We were recording approximately a show a week, every week. And so I needed faster access to him. That's why we replaced him with Ephraim. That said, I loved Ephraim, and I think we were so lucky to have him. And he was actually our second choice. And the only reason he wasn't our first choice was that Clive actually is British.
Yes.
And so we thought, okay, Alfred is British, let's hire the true Brit. But I thought Ephraim's performance was so sensitive and lovely and wonderful. And it's so funny because recently my husband and I have been watching a couple of different channels that air some of the really early black and white shows like 77 Sunset Strip and these series that you see someone like Ephraim Zimbalist as this incredibly handsome young man. And when I was working with him, he was already well into his 80s, I think, and so elegant and so lovely and so grateful for the job. And he would also be sitting there in the room waiting to see who the other guests were that I had brought in for that week. He was just delightful. As far as Harley, I think that the reason we replaced Harley had to do with also an availability issue with Arlene. I just don't think we could get her. And so that was Tara. And then what was the other?
Melissa Gilbert, yeah.
Batgirl, yes. There was so the reason that we didn't want the voices to change so drastically that people would go, oh my gosh, that's not Batgirl, or oh, that's not Harley. We wanted them to still be able to buy into the fact that this is a valid voice for that character. But I never asked anyone to do an impression of the existing voice. Unlike, say, a show like, not even a show I worked on, say like any of the Charlie Brown stuff, the Peanuts stuff. There was, over my career, I probably saw 10 different kids' resumes with the credit of the voice of Charlie Brown. And that's because there weren't that many kids, because they kept growing out of the voice.
Right, sure.
That's a 10-year-old voice, and that happens with boys. Their voices change. And but that was always an attempt to find someone who sounded just like the first Charlie Brown. That they wanted to remain consistent. Anytime they had to replace the kids, they wanted it to sound as close to the original as they could. We weren't nearly as keen on that as much as creating a bona fide voice for a character that the audience would embrace and that the actor felt comfortable doing. And I think Tara did a great job on all that. And, there were times when, depending upon other projects, when the characters would appear, that people would say, we don't want to use the same voice for Harley. We want a different voice for that. So possibly, and I can't even tell you what series it is, but I know that I used Hynden Walsh quite often as Harley. And that was a different version. They just were different. And it wasn't because somebody wasn't doing a good job or anything. It was just that it was requested of me to have a different person voice it because it was meant to be a different project.
Yeah, exactly. And I know Kevin said before that if I'm not, and this is, Kevin saying this, so maybe he remembers it differently possibly, but he said he was the last person all of you saw for Batman because you just could not find who you wanted to be Bruce Wayne Batman, and that he was recommended because he's a theater person, and that kind of opened up, I'm not sure if it was just you or if it was other people who were working on the series to, hey, we need to start looking at theatrical people more for these voice roles.
Absolutely. That's partially true, and it's just a little bit off, but absolutely. The Bruce and I had gotten, I probably told you this for sure, I listened to, I think, thousands of voices for that series, initial casting, because there were a lot of regulars on it. So every character had many, many submissions. And then for Batman specifically, I called back, I think something like golly, I'm forgetting my numbers now, hundreds. I think 200 people I called back for the voice of Batman. And we had gotten to the point where Bruce and I were like, there's 3 or 4 guys that could play it. But that's hardly a rave. That's hardly for a character like that you want. And so at the time, I was living with a dear friend of mine that we'd gone to college together, both of us in the theater department. And I asked him, and he was an agent at the time representing actors on camera. And I said, is there anybody and I showed him the list of all the actors I had read. And I said, is there anybody you can think of that I should see that I haven't? And he said, there's this wonderful actor named Kevin Conroy. He's Juilliard trained. He's on a couple of soaps. He's got lots of theatrical credits. He's terrific. He's got a beautiful voice. And so we brought him in, and this was near the end of the casting process. And I think he was in for the final callbacks. And when he spoke, and we could see that he totally understood the character. He had done his homework. He likened it to Hamlet, so
Yeah.
already he was on my good side, and just totally nailed it. Now the thing about theatrical, that did open up a bit to the theatrical actors, but I already was on board about bringing in actors with stage experience, because I learned pretty early on that those kinds, back when I was at Hanna-Barbera, that actors with stage experience understand that slightly projected energy, that slightly boosted energy that you have to use on stage, as opposed to people who had only worked on film and TV, which is very small and very intimate. And that doesn't always work. It works sometimes in animation for feature films where a tiny little gasp is very effective on a big screen with magnificent, sound and everything. But for TV, those kind of subtleties don't always work. It has to be a little bit bigger, a little bit broader, but not, the Smurfs. We're not doing SpongeBob SquarePants.
Right.
It needs to be. And so I was a big fan. And when I was at Hanna-Barbera, the casting director there, I was working with Gordon Hunt, who had been the casting director at the Mark Taper Forum. So he knew a ton of actors who he thought would be very good for voiceover. And he and I would sit together and go through lists of actors and go, who would be fun for this? Let's bring in Nancy Linari. Let's bring in B.J. Ward. Let's bring in, Jeffrey Tambor. So all these people that had done work with Gordon when he was at the Taper.
I know we've talked about before when we've had you on to talk about Justice League that you weren't a comic book person. You didn't grow up reading comic books, but there were...
I did not. Not the action ones. We didn't have them in our house at all. We couldn't afford them, number one. And our school said that they were of the mind that comic books were written up to a fourth grade level, and then after that, you're regressing.
Oh, wow.
If you're in sixth grade and you're reading a comic book, you're reading at a fourth grade level.
I'm still regressing.
And so I don't know that I agree with that, but that's what they said. And so we weren't encouraged to read them. And I just didn't have them around. The very few that I did ever see were either the romance comics or like Jughead, Archie and, that stuff. I never ever read a Batman comic book or a Superman or any of that stuff until I started working on the show.
And then that begs the question, too, because a lot of the writers who are credited in the series the stories were brought from the comic books. Obviously, and I feel horrible because I'm reading the names of people who are no longer with us, like Denny O'Neil, Len Wein, Steve Englehart, Neil Adams. So when there was a script that comes in, and let's say it's based on one of the Neil Adams, Denny O'Neil stories, did you personally say, okay, where's that comic book? I want to read it to take direction? Or did someone else did the like Tom Ruger or something, I've read this, here's what we're going for, and kind of, how did you approach that?
Talk about a segue, because if she was going to go somewhere to get some comics to read up on Batman, I'd send her to Bugs Comics and Games. I'll send you there too. BugsComicsandGames.com is the website. If you are looking for a new place to buy your comic books, maybe your store is closed. If you're wanting to get back into the hobby, maybe you've been out of it for a while and now you're kind of hearing Andrea talk about Batman the Animated Series and you've been watching the Marvel movies in the theaters and everything like that, you're wanting to get back into it, Bugs Comics
What type
and
of
Games
experience do you expect
is the
when choosing
place
your real
to
estate?
go. That was because I had the Playout 1 open, so these live radio things happen. BugsComicsandGames.com is the website. You want to check them out. And if you're in the greater St. Louis area, they're right there between Highway 70, or you can get to them from the Page Extension 364. They're on Bryan Road in O'Fallon. If you're watching this right now and you're not in the greater St. Louis, St. Charles area, you may want to go to the website, BugsComicsandGames.com. Check out the variants they have. Maybe your local store doesn't have the variants that you want, those hard-to-find variant comics. They've got a lot of their stock online, and they're constantly buying. If you're wanting to divulge yourself from your collection, if you want to get out from under it, talk to Larry and Tim. They will happily cut you a great deal on your collection, and that's why if you go there, you might go in 2 weeks and find a whole batch of new comics because they're constantly buying as well. Be sure to check out the website, and please give them a like on Facebook. Bugs Comics and Games on Facebook. Give their page a like. We would appreciate that, and so would they. It's a great place to buy your comic books. Make sure you check them out, BugsComicsandGames.com. We were talking with Andrea Romano, as we are for this entire hour, and before we took that quick little intermission there, I'd asked her about how she was familiar with comic books, and if she wasn't, who got her to read what she needed to read to know what she needed to know for the episodes.
Well, Bruce Timm was a very good determiner of what I needed to see. And so much more later when we started making the movies, that's when I always read the graphic novels or the comics that they were based on. I mean, there's a couple that we made that were practically page by page of the comic book was the storyboard for what we made. But as far as the animated series, I rarely ever read a comic book unless I was. I just went to the source. I went to Bruce Timm and Paul Dini and Alan Burnett and said, "Can you guys tell me who the heck this guy is? Who's Scarecrow? What's this guy's story? Who's this? I never heard of this villain before," and that kind of stuff. And while I really did love those stories that were based on comic books. And specific stories that were created in comic books, I loved the ones that the guys came up with on their own. Yeah. Where they just, I can't even tell you exactly which ones those are, or that I recognize them at the moment. But people who had been reading Batman comic books, actors who would come in, they'd say, "Oh my gosh, I recognize this from blah blah blah," or whatever. I liked the ones where it was just. It came from their love of the comic books, but creating their own stories, and I love that. I think maybe there's a Batman in my basement. That might be one of those types of episodes, and stuff like that, where it was just clever and it had to do more with what we were doing than what had been done previously by other artists, meaning the writers who wrote the comic books.
And to the credit of the show, we mentioned before Heart of Ice, Mr. Freeze's origin. That was not technically his origin in the comic books, but now it's been retconned in comic books that, yes, what happened with him and his wife and everything, that is the new origin definitively in the comic books. And again, with Harley Quinn, Detective Renee Montoya, both of those characters introduced in the series are now players in the comic book. Renee Montoya has gone on to become the new Question in DC universe. It's amazing how these characters have found life of their own.
How about Harley? I mean, every time I open up, the Emmy submissions, I'm like, there's another Harley show in there. There's another, my goodness, and there's so many of them, and many actors have played her, and there's all these different incarnations and stuff, and I thought that was totally an invention by Bruce and Paul, and what a fantastic character. And, you walk around on Halloween, and there's tons of people dressed as Harley. They just love that character, and how cool that our guys created it. It wasn't just something that some other artist had created years ago that we used.
Tim Daly recently told me that Andrea Romano did not suffer fools. That's why everyone loved working with you and working with other people, because it was only pleasant people who you would cast. Was that a conscious decision, like, oh, this person's got a bit of a reputation, I'm not going to even see them or anything like that?
Absolutely. There were times when I would call up to ask for a certain actor that I hadn't worked with before. And the agents, because they knew me so well, because I'd worked for so many years and I had been an agent myself, so I understood their side of the story as well. But I would call them up and ask for a certain actor, and they would say, "Andrea, it won't be a pleasant experience. Don't do it. I know he's my client. I know I should pitch him and sell him, but I know you, Andrea, and I know your cast, and I know that would not be fun for you. You won't like it." And so I was very grateful for that honesty and for that input. And there were times, too, and I remember calling up actors, like watching something, an on-camera series. I remember calling Nathan Fillion after an episode of, I think it was Castle at the time he was doing, and there was an actor that I heard that had this fabulous voice, really gravelly and wonderful, and it was a guest star he was doing on the series. And I called up Nathan and said, I want to use this guy. Is he a good guy? Would he understand what we do? Would he have fun? He's like, absolutely, great guy, exactly the kind of people that you like to have. So I was never afraid to do the research I needed to, because I didn't want anybody in there to wreck the beautiful energy that I had built over years, and somebody to come in and we did have a couple of situations where I had to replace people who came in. There was one guy, I will not mention him by name, but he came in and I had been waiting for years to use this actor, and his availability was just dreadful. And finally I got him, and he was going to do 2 episodes of this one show. We were going to record it both on the same day, and he came to the session drunk.
Oh my gosh.
And I didn't even know he was drunk. I just knew he was behaving poorly. And the girl who used to lean over the actors as they signed their contracts and show them where to sign here, sign here, sign here, initial here, she was the one who came to me and said, he's drunk, right? And I was like, that's why he's being so weird. And I had to replace him because it was a villain character, and I know he could play it. His on-camera work showed that he could play it, but he just kept saying, I can't get any bigger than this. This is as big as my voice will go. And I'm like, no, I know you can do more. And I worked with him, and I kindly, and I just tried. But, when you have that kind of affectation, which is the drunken, I can't battle that. I can deal with an actor's mentality, but I can't deal with something that's
physical impairment. Yeah, no.
Exactly.
So I wonder, and again, I'm not asking for specifics or anything like that, but how does that work? Do you kindly let the person finish their session, or it'd be like, you know what? We got all we need. You're good. Thanks for going. How does that work in a situation like that?
I do let them finish the session. Session. And basically what I say, I take my hand off the talk back, and I talk to the people who are in the room with me, and I say, I'm just going to walk this person through the rest of the episode. Don't give me pickup notes on this person. We're going to replace him. Just let me get through it, and we'll talk about who to bring in next week to replace him. So I never as a matter of fact, there was one time when an actor was brought in. This was not a show I was casting, but someone was trying to find someone who was a musician, actually a singer, and he had the same name as an actor in SAG. And the casting director hired the actor in SAG who was not a voiceover actor, who was not even a really serious working actor. And the guy came in, and you could tell clearly this was the wrong guy. And he would, when you see a script and things are written in parentheses like scream or gasp, you don't say that word, you do the action, right? And so this guy's reading his script, and he's like, what are you doing here? Gasp. I was like, oh, oops. Okay, and I would take my hand off the talk back and say, let me just get him through the session, and then we'll replace him. But no, I never want to hurt an actor's feelings. I was an actor. They're so sensitive, and that's what you want. You want a sensitive human being to be voicing these characters. You don't want a technician. You want someone who's putting their heart into it. So then to thrash them in some way. And someone once called me the velvet hammer. They say you beat up people, but you never can tell because they're, because I would keep working with them until I got what we needed. But I always did it with respect and kindness. And eventually I would give them a line reading. I didn't like to resort to that from the get-go, but after 5, 6, 7 takes, if they weren't getting it, I would just very quickly say, echo me, and do the line the way it needed to go, and then they would do it, and before they even knew it, they had been line read. So that was the trick, was just get it back. And the truth of it is, while I loved their ideas, I had been and have been working in the animation industry for so long, I knew what would work. I knew what we needed. That didn't mean that there weren't other options, and if the actor gave me that, we would always go, hey, that's not what we were thinking, but that's kind of better than what we were thinking. Let's use his version. But for the most part, I had to get the one take that I knew would work.
And I don't want to keep you too much longer. I know we're coming up on the time limit here. One of the things I was wondering, because you worked on Batman the Animated Series, we've listed at least a dozen names already of just fantastic people, from Mark Hamill to Ed Asner, Michael Ansara from Zimbalist Jr. With all these different characters you've cast, you obviously been doing this. You had a great instinct because these still are definitive voices for a lot of these characters. But was there one or two people who you knew they were the right person, but they came in and just leveled up in front of your eyes and like, this is better than I even dreamed? Be it Adrienne Barbeau as Catwoman, Paul Williams as Penguin. Was there any person who you recollect like, wow, I am even blown away?
That was practically every time. It really was, because you hope that they'll be wonderful. You hope that they'll get it. That Paul Williams would come in and understand that we wanted him to play the Penguin slightly cartoony, slightly broad, certainly not the Adam West series, Burgess Meredith Penguin, but then they suddenly, it's not just the performance, it's also their generosity of spirit and their generosity of and this is going to sound so ridiculous, their generosity of storytelling. By that I mean, the first time Mark Hamill came in to work for me, it was not as the Joker. It was a guest star role. And at the time, I didn't even know he wanted to play the Joker. I just knew he wanted to be a part of the series. And so we brought him in as a guest. And he did a terrific job. And afterwards, he pulled me aside to tell me, I really want to be a part of the series. And then it just so happened that we had to replace the Joker. It worked out perfectly. But while, what happens is you rehearse the show, you record the show, you give the actors a break. I get notes from everybody who's in the booth with me, whether it's the animation director or Bruce Timm or the writer or whatever. We get notes, an editor saying there was an overlap there. We have to fix that, anything like that. And during that time, the actors just chat. Well, Mark was so generous with his Star Wars stories. I could see, even though I couldn't hear them because we mute the microphones, I could see the whole cast, their mouths just wide open, just looking at Mark telling these fabulous Star Wars stories. And then, Paul Williams, we're working on an episode and we needed a melody. And he goes, oh, you could, how about blah, 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 use this. I said, Paul, we need to use something that won't cost us thousands and thousands of dollars that you've written. It needs to be. But his instinct was, let me give you a song. And how kind and generous that is. So there was never, I always hoped that they would bring it. And it almost always happened. It was very rare that I ever had to replace an actor because, as I told you before, I would keep them after school and work with them until we reached a wall that we just couldn't get through. If we just couldn't get there, I wouldn't beat them up to the point where I'm just making them feel bad about themselves. But, yeah, and probably after I hang up this call, I'll think of some other fabulous person that did do what you're asking. But, I mean, it happened almost on a daily basis. I still am in awe of Kevin Conroy when he performs. It's shockingly good. It's you hear when you prep, as a voice director, when you prep a script, you hear it in your head. You hear the performance. And more often than not, that's what would come out of these actors' mouths, is exactly what I anticipated. And then sometimes it's something different and wonderful and usable and fantastic, but the connection was always, and I wanted to say this before we were talking about people saying nice things about me, by the way, thank you very much for that. I love actors. I love actors. Having been one, I understand them.
Yeah.
And what they go through every day just to get the gig, not even to do the work, but to get the gig. It's so heartbreaking and random, and you just never know why you got that one and why you didn't get that one that you really wanted. And, trying to get from one place in town across to the other place in town so you can get in an audition and not be late or get to the gig on time, and all the stuff that an actor has to go through, I have such respect for. And I think that played largely into why actors liked working with me. I understood their process. Mm-hmm. I understood what their problems might be. I understood a lot of their insecurities, which I was able to help them get over. And so I think that's why there was a mutual respect, that they knew they could trust me, that I wouldn't embarrass them, and that they would be able to do their very best work. And it always amazes me when you find directors who either don't like actors or don't respect actors. I kind of think, why are you in this?
Right.
Maybe do another job. Maybe do something else, because it's a magnificent job. It's a wonderful career. It's in the entertainment industry, but it's not the pressure of an on-camera series. It's not lots of pressure. Not to say that it was an easy gig,
right.
But some of the limits put on people who are working on feature films and stuff is so overwhelming. It's kind of like what's happening to a lot of the sports people who are either retiring from sports or retiring from promoting things because mental health.
Yeah, Tom Holland.
You need to have your head about you. And so, but anyhow, I was delighted to have this career, and I'm so grateful that people responded positively to it.
And I've just one last question for you before I let you go. Obviously, we think of Batman, Riddler, Two-Face, the Catwoman, these larger-than-life characters. All these street-level people like Bob Hastings as Commissioner Gordon, Bobby Costanza as Bullock, and Ingrid, I hope I'm saying it right, Ingrid Olu as Renee Montoya. Right. When we're going to have Ingrid on the show here as well, casting those people and also working with those people, they're not over the top. They're not superheroes or supervillains. Was it a different experience, or did you approach working with those types, the street level, everyday characters, differently than you did when you worked with the superheroes or supervillains?
Very interesting question. I don't think my process was any different. I think I treated them, there was something like, there's always a thought like this. For example, with Bobby Costanzo and Bob Hastings, both excellent actors, excellent in those roles. They're what we call actors who have voices with character. Their voices are kind of recognizable. Even recently, my husband and I were flipping around. We're watching a Gunsmoke episode. I wasn't looking at the screen. I hear Bob Hastings' voice. I'm like, hey, that's Bob Hastings, because it's a voice of character. You can recognize it. Bobby Costanzo, you can recognize that voice. It's just a voice. It's a fantastic, fantastic character voice. So as opposed to people doing character voices, which is what Mark Hamill is doing, for example, for the Joker. But so I like using actors who have character voices, their voices are already identifiable. The problem with it is you can't use them as secondary characters in the show in the same episode where they're playing the main character. So I couldn't use Bullock as a thug, where you always want to be able to use actors for as many voices as you can. 3 voices gives you a benefit, a price break.
Yeah.
But I liked that they had recognizable voices. When Bobby Costanzo would open his mouth, would appear in an episode, and the initial entrance would be an off-screen voice, you knew it was Bullock. If he would say, hey, what's going on over there? You knew it was Bobby. Yeah. If you heard Bob Hastings say, Batman, get down, you knew it was Bob Hastings, and you knew it was Commissioner Gordon. And so I liked using some of those guys. It did make for a very large cast, which I loved. But it did also require that when I would bring in secondary characters or guest stars, that I brought in more of the rank and file actor who can do multiple voices. So I could bring in a Rob Paulson who could do 3 voices for me. He could be, the maitre d' at the restaurant and the sidekick to the Penguin and, the telephone operator. Those somebody could do 3 voices all in the same episode that you wouldn't be recognizable. But no, I didn't treat it that differently. It really was, there were specifics like, for Montoya, we knew it had to be a female. We knew it had to be Latina. And so that limited, always I tried to book actors who were the ethnic background that the character was going to be depicted as. It didn't always happen, but, the Screen Actors Guild was very good about saying, you have to prove that you tried. Yeah. You can't just say, I'm not going to try to get a Latina. I'm just going to book a white person and just be done with it. That's wrong. So, but sometimes what you had to prove to SAG was I did a really large search. I didn't find anybody who does it better than this Caucasian actor, and that's where we're going to go. And so then usually they'd say that's fine. But it's wrong, I think, for people to just, hire a Caucasian actor when the character is going to be depicted as black. That said, there would be characters sometimes who would just be described as cashier or clerk or whatever, and you can't tell what sex they are. And almost invariably, whoever I would cast, if there was a woman on the session who was playing a guest star role and she could play the clerk who has the line of, here's your change, sir, inevitably, when the animation came back, it would be drawn as a male character. Yeah. I don't know why that would happen so often. So we'd have to go in and ADR it with somebody else and try to fix it. But it was, but those kinds of things were always like, they're just as important as the big characters, just as important. I wanted to make sure that the show maintained quality, that it wasn't, the main characters are so good, but the guests are really kind of meh. I wanted to make sure everybody was. And then, the more that they came in to do work, the better they got, and the more the writers were inspired to write more episodes for them.
Yeah.
So that was always kind of a fun thing to watch a character. I always thought there should be more Riddler episodes. There's only like 3 or 4 of them. And I love that character, but they only ended up in like 3 or 4 episodes. I don't know why.
They said it was something to do with working out all the plots and the puzzles was overly complex. They felt, from what we've already proven IMDb is wrong on several things, so I'm not gonna say that holds much water.
But that makes sense at least. That one at least makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as I don't want to keep. I know it's always been. I could literally have you on for another 2 hours to talk to you about everything. I'm always appreciative of your time. You've been on the show several times now, and it is literally never gets old talking to you. You are absolutely brilliant. Thank you for your time, and thank you for bringing us Batman the Animated Series.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure always talking with you, and I hope that we get a chance to see each other again soon, live at one of these Comic-Cons, as soon as this pandemic is truly over.
And, of course, if you have a chance to get to see Andrea Romano, I highly recommend you do it. Want to make sure we tell you about our premier sponsor, the people without whom this show would not be possible. That, of course, is the Greater St. Charles Convention and Visitors Bureau. Make sure you check out their website, discoverstcharles.com. That's discoverstcharles.com. As we always say, it's an historically good time. It's a lot of nice weather here. Today was just a beautiful day. It was nice and cool, not too hot. Get out and enjoy some of that. Get out and hopefully play in Frontier Park, take a bike ride on the Katy Trail. Just walk around. Go and get yourself an ice cream or something like that from Kilwins or from Riverside Sweets and stroll the cobblestone streets. Take in all this scenery. It's a great place to visit. And if you're listening from outside the greater St. Louis, St. Charles area, come plan your trip for Halloween. If you're a Halloween fan, you got to check out Legends and Lanterns, the big festival they have going on in St. Charles. Plan your trip no matter if you're here or from out of town. Plan your trip at the website, discoverstcharles.com. As we always say, it's an historically good time. Very proud to have them as our premier sponsor here on the show. Once again, if you want to hear the full interview with Andrea Romano, go to geektomeradio.com. It'll be uploaded there later this week. Thanks, as always, to Joey V, who always makes the show sound as good as it does, puts in all the hard work, and keeps the show running. Without him, I would not still be doing this. Thank you to all of you who listened tonight. Thank you for your comments. And until next week, my friends.
This is Geek to Me Radio.
Thank you, Gotham City. Good night.
The Big 550 KTRS St. Louis.